Hello and welcome. I'm Francesca Bellei, PhD student at Harvard University, and here we have John Gennari, professor of English at the University of Vermont, and author of the book Flavour and Soul. And he'll be talking about his book to us today. So, John, one of the qualities that really made your book stand out to me was how it's clear that it's a very personal and highly effective journey for the reader, as well as I imagine it must have been for the writer. And you conclude by calling for a sensuous scholarship, attentive to the realm of feeling. And you say that this will be crucial for navigating the social challenges of the 21st century. So I wonder to what extent the material that you were studying had an impact on the methodology that you yourself employ and that you think will be crucial to employ also in the future.
Thank you, Francesca. A great question, because I do think the book is an effort to model a kind of scholarly voice that I would like to hear more of. Not my particular voice, but I would like for scholars to think more about how they can bring their personal voices into their scholarship. I mean, this is not an original idea at all, but I think it's especially important when we're writing about experiences that have to do with race and ethnicity and the kind of collisions and collusions between different communities, because I think that as important, as powerful, as indispensable as our social scientific approaches and more traditional academic approaches to that subject, I think that those experiences, those kind of cultural intersections that I'm concerned with, they're so loaded with feeling and emotion, and I think that I distrust oftentimes things that I read that don't admit as much and try to suppress or repress emotion in the name of scholarly objectivity or scholarly professionalism. And so I have the advantage with this book of having previously gained tenure and having jumped through some hoops professionally to get to a point where the anxiety about authority and how the scholarship will or will not be seen as serious was less than it had been as a graduate student and an assistant professor. But I really hope that this sort of thing is filtering its way down to the way that professors are training graduate students. I mean, it's I think it's been in the air for a generation at least how important it is to not only master the archive and master the previous scholarly literature, but to really make a strong impact on a field. And I mean, there are dangers to going in the direction of the personal, to be sure, but I'm willing to take that risk, and particularly for a book like this, which if one reads the acknowledgments and some of the personal stuff that's in interwoven into the chapters, this book grows out of my personal experience growing up in a working class Italian American family, now living in a multiracial family with an African American wife and our twin daughters who we adopted in Ethiopia 10 years ago. But it also has to do with the way when I got interested in ethnic studies and critical race and ethnic studies, as we call it now at the University of Vermont, my professional institutional experience was in African American studies, where my previous work on jazz had positioned me, and this field, Italian American Studies, that I didn't know even existed before I began to think about this. And those professional networks, the conferences that one would go to, the scholars that one interacted with, there was a shared sense among Italian Americans and African Americans that we were tired of these kind of professional spaces and discourses in which emotion and feeling, weren't present. And there's, of course, the danger of essentializing ourselves as overly emotional people, Black people and Italian people, and we're a people of performance and performativity, and we like to sing, and we like to cry, and we like to we like to eat, we like to emote. But I think that way of thinking about your professional work can be really liberating, and that you don't have to spend 8 hours at a colloquium without eating or breaking into song and putting it out. So I try to find a flavorful and soulful voice for a book that I'm calling Flavor and Soul.
Another question that I was very keen to ask you was that about the ways in which you talk about how Italian American and African American communities have met and clashed and created together in a way that has had a profound influence on American culture writ large, as you say. Mm-hmm. And given the close ties that Italy has tried to keep and with its migrants and vice versa, what of that cultural political encounter has traveled back to Italy, do you think?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, not being an expert myself on in Italian studies or in Italian culture, but through this work, having connected with scholars from Italy and Italian American scholars who are interested in transnational circulations of culture, it has really become, I think, the direction that the scholarship needs to go. I mean, I think when we think about typically we think about Italian American history in the Italian American context. There's there are certain ways in which the Great Wave of immigration 130 years ago, and that story of assimilation and Italian Americans moving out of urban enclaves to the suburbs and that sort of thing, post World War II. I mean, that's a kind of standardized narrative that misses so much about the continued transatlantic flow of people and ideas and sound and food that continues to our own time. So to give you one example, in music, in jazz historiography, obviously New Orleans is extremely important as a kind of originary space. And it's only very recently that a full reckoning with the Italian and predominantly Sicilian influence on the emergence of jazz in early 20th century New Orleans has surfaced. And so it tends to focus on the particular musicians who are in those communities. But the fact is that New Orleans was just one of several transatlantic spaces in which that kind of collision was taking place. Naples and Palermo and Buenos Aires, which of course had a huge Italian migrant population, and people who are doing work now on there's a new book on Latin American jazz called Tropical Riffs, which I've only had a chance to skim at the moment, but it already has kind of quickened my sense of the importance of thinking about Buenos Aires in connection with New Orleans and Naples as a kind of triangle trade, if you will, in not just jazz, but the emergence of tango and other kind of popular dance forms, and this continues. The huge kind of presence of rap and hip hop culture in Italy. That's come from several directions, including African migrants into Italy who get connected with the music, and I mean that to me is probably the most fascinating contemporary example of a kind of story that aligns with what was happening 100 years ago with jazz, but of course has its own particularity because of different media infrastructure and such.
In a way, the history of Italian migration is also deeply connected to the colonial enterprise in Italy. The colonial invasion of Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia were partly motivated by a desire to redirect these huge migratory flows. So I wonder what does that mean for Italian Americans who in the U.S. were so often occupied an ambiguous position on the color line, as you explain in your book, but also for the ways in which they related themselves to the African American community in the U.S. at that time.
So I end the book with a story about an Eritrean immigrant to this country in the late 1970s who became a friend of mine, Fikre Gabriesus, who quite tragically died just a few weeks after his 50th birthday, now about 5 years ago. And he had fought in the Eritrean-Ethiopian Civil War, lost a brother in that war, and then came to New Haven, Connecticut with a couple brothers and opened a restaurant, Cafe Adulis, that became just a spectacular, kind of crossroads of food and culture and conviviality in New Haven. And it was Fikre's wife who actually introduced me to my wife, and they got to know each other in the space of Fikre's restaurant. And what struck me in my relationship with Fikre was that he was an East African man who was a Renaissance, truly a Renaissance man. He was a painter. He was maybe one of the best read, people I knew from the classical antiquity on forward to contemporary politics. I grew up in an Italian America in which at a time when Italians had sort of become racially classified as white, yes, after 100 years ago being ambivalently or ambiguously positioned in connection to the Jim Crow race line. But in the U.S. context, Italianness, at a certain point became aligned with whiteness.
It became white.
It became white. Here is Fikre, the most Italian person I had ever met in terms of his command of the language, his understanding of the history, his sense of the future of Italian culture in the arts and the expressive cultures. And he taught me so much about that history. I mean, he was educated by the colonial, the vestiges of the colonial Italian system. And he had a very interestingly ambivalent, kind of relationship to Italian culture as a result. He loved the language. He knew it was the language of the colonial oppressor. And he also had, he couldn't quite make up his mind about where to position himself in the American context when he heard scholars talking about how important it was for Italians and Italian Americans to get over this kind of exceptionalist ideology about Italy, that Italy was a more gentle colonial presence, and the way in which Italy likes to think of itself because of its being the underdogs in Europe and such,
Yes.
as not being capable of the kind of racist oppression as the
No.
Northern European powers. So he was quite learned in that, and very articulate about wanting me and others to understand about the brutalities of the Italian presence in East Africa, but he was also, as I say, culturally the most deeply Italian person. He's also a deeply African person in a way. His art and his cooking and his presence sort of sum up for me the way that what I'm trying to get at in a mostly U.S. centric context in this book just becomes so much more interested and complicated if you add the transnational piece.
Thank you so much, John, for being here today, and thank you for writing this wonderful book. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.